I think truly there is usually one or two teachers who actually push you into doing something which you find very interesting. And I had a chemistry teacher called Mr. Raja Rao. He would encourage all of us to talk about chemistry, the elements, and how the history of chemistry, starting from Berzelius and Bunsen and people like that. An impressionable age, you can really get pretty excited about this. And right in my intermediate, I decided I want to do chemistry. No experiment, no nothing. It was just learning from the teacher. And there's some atrocious book at that time called University Chemistry by Mr. Mitra. We all thought that's the best book there is. Experimentation was one very little, but this was sufficient. I also think it may have to do with the family, because as I said, my uncle has, he had 6 daughters. Daughter number 3, Savitri, was married to a fellow called Balasubramanian. Okay, he had just come back from New York after his PhD. The marriage was held in Pilani, and of course we were all completely gaga over an American returned brother-in-law and so on. And he was also a chemistry PhD. And he was telling me also how, actually he even said, it's more enjoyable to do your PhD in America than in England. That England, the British PhD, in terms of academic requirements, courses and things of that kind, is qualitatively different. It leaves you to yourself. Whereas the American, I think, somewhat more structured. That probably is more suitable for people like me who are not all that smart, but who have to do. You put yourself into one kind of a discipline or a timetable kind of a thing, and that worked out. And I think that clearly must have been one other influence also. I was a professor of chemistry at that time in the University of Hyderabad. My interest in research has always been bordering between biology and chemistry, what people call as biophysics or biophysical chemistry and so on. Dr. Bhargava persuaded me at that time to come over and join the CCMB to be really, not quite CCMB yet. And he said, you continue on as a professor and come over and work in CCMB. And he also said that he is going to get one more person, this time a physicist who turned biologist, the late Dr. M.R. Das. So the 3 of us actually sat together and initiated CCMB. I trained as a physical chemist, so for me, looking at molecules, studying molecules was just as important as studying cells, organs or organisms. So the molecules, particularly protein molecules, and the way to look at them was by using spectroscopy. So for quite a while I actually was doing spectroscopy and also initiated a new form of spectroscopy to look at biological molecules. It was called photoacoustic spectroscopy. Dr. Mohan Rao, who was my student at that time, and I did some remarkably nice. We actually looked at the entire lens, eye lens. We looked at the malaria parasite, because these are things that you couldn't have observed otherwise. So brand new forms of spectroscopy to look at what happens in a cell, what happens in a bacterium, and so on. This is something. You see, this is a form of spectroscopy where I can take a spectrum of this floor and tell you what the components in this are. Okay, it's a very, at that time it was a very new form of spectroscopy. We were pushing it in biology. We actually looked at the spectrum and therefore the components of the eye lens, because it was easy to get, it was transparent, and so on. And if you shine light on that, it will chemical changes will happen. You could monitor the entire thing. It was a very nice, and that put me on to the lens story. But I should really say, the man who pushed me into doing full-fledged lens biology was the late Dr. Bireshwar Chakrabarti. He is no more, also a physical chemist just like I was trained, and we met in a common meeting in of all places in Mexico. And I was showing some results and he was showing some results. We began talking, and he was pretty enthusiastic that I should push. In fact, he even came to CCMB. I think that was the turning point of my really taking over. About the same time, a little later than that, I would say more like 1986-87, this brand new institute called the LVPEI Institute started in Hyderabad. And now comes this man, Gullapalli Nageshwar Rao, and we began talking a little. And clearly, here was a meeting of mine. Here is, I am a scientist, very little knowledge of ophthalmology. So, in ophthalmology is interested in science. So, when we got together in 87, said, let us work together, but I was still in CCME, remember. So, we struck up a deal that every day one doctor from LVPEI will come to CCMB. And every so often, we will come over to LVPEI. But the research facilities are only in CCMB. Clinical facilities were here at the LVP. So this went on for several years. Well, you see, when I came back from the US to come and join as a faculty member in IIT in Kanpur, we already had several people, my colleagues, senior colleagues, who were fellows of the Indian Academy of Sciences, and that's the first time I actually came to know sufficiently well about this academy. Earlier on, we had kind of read that the academy was started by Professor C.V. Raman as early as about 1928-30, around that time. So, but the first real understanding of the value of the academy came to me as a faculty member in around 1967-68 or so. There are a couple of journals that the academy used to publish. One of them was an association with an association actually called Current Science Association. Current Science was a journal that almost all of us scientists would look at. It is a general purpose journal, but always it said along with the Indian Academy of Sciences, and so that already was a big information source for us. And then Indian Academy of Sciences also had special journals in chemical sciences, and since I was in the faculty in chemistry, I was particularly interested in that. And as I said, there are three of my senior colleagues were already fellows, Professor C.N.R. Rao, Professor P.T. Narasimhan, and Professor M.V. George. They were all fellows, and so we would, as youngsters, we'll hear from them what all happens and so on. So over time, I think interest more and more gathered in my mind. I think it might have been 1981. around that, I think early 81, 82, something of that kind. I think Professor Satish Dhawan was the president at that time, I think. And I think we had it somewhere in Kerala. It might have been Trivandrum, I'm not certain. And as a brand new elected fellow, you're supposed to give a lecture. Okay. Before all these Jambawans, you're supposed to give a lecture. And I was just shaking like mad. And he comes and puts his hand on my shoulder and said, "Kuch nahi hoga. You just talk like you're talking to your students," and so on. And here was another fantastic man. Okay. For him, there was no nothing. There was no impossible. He just will do it. So I think it was early 80s. And then I think I began quite active as an academician, running some little summer courses and so on. All the academies. In the Indian Academy, I think I was in the council for 2 terms. I think it might have been during Kasturi Rangan's time and then P.V. Ramakrishna's time. And then the offer came as, why don't I become the president and so on. It also turned out very nicely. It was around the Platinum Jubilee year, okay, during my term. And we started some new initiatives during the Platinum Jubilee. First of all, we'll elect very large number. Okay. Normally, election of a fellow is pretty restricted. In a given year, you don't elect more than about 25, 30 people. With the result, even very good people have to wait for a long time. And then when you start looking at the average age of a newly elected fellow, it runs into the upper 50s. You don't want that. What you want is catch them young. The same way, C.V. Raman, who started the academy, he selected and elected fellows in their 30s, sometimes even their 20s, certainly in their 40s and so on. So that Platinum Jubilee time, it became possible, at least as a one-time thing, to elect maybe as many as 75 fellows, just that 1 year. We did not. I mean, we elected I think more like about 40 or something, but a very large number of youngsters. And then gender imbalance. So you had to look at, if 2 people are good, equally good, and one has 2 X chromosomes, one has XY chromosome, take the double X. Okay, that kind of a thing. So you have to do, this is not a reservation, this is what you may call affirmative action. That's something we were able to get in some. About the same time, we also decided, along with Rohini Godbole and Professor Ram Ramaswamy, he and Rohini got together and said we will actually do women in science, a collection of as many as about 100 women who are practicing some form of science as scientists. And the book came out and they actually called that Leelavati's Daughters, in celebration and in homage to Leelavati, probably the youngest female mathematician anybody ever knew. So Rohini's idea of calling them Leelavati's Daughters was very, very good. So some of these were new things that we were able to put together. And then I started a couple of things. See, there are a large number of people in India who are already in their practicing scientists who are in their 70s, 80s, occasionally in their 90s as well. Publicly funded institutions like universities, institutes and so on have their own rules, regulations and stipulations that you cannot support anybody. So if you were to have, for example, just like we have short-term professors, visiting professors, we initiated Silla Jubilee visiting professorship for, yes, by and large, senior level Indian scientists who have done very, very well. Okay, this is one. I think increasing the number of fellows and then joint publications bordering between disciplines and so on. These are things that really happen. Okay, and coming together with the other 2 academies, in fact 3 academies as well, and joint position papers and so on. We by and large at the Bangalore Academy do not come out with position papers on issues of economic, that kind of a thing. We certainly look at only science for science, engineering. These, I would say, were really my arch goals during the time of my 3 years. This was definitely during the British times. India was still part of the British Empire, and scientists of British origin had already started something called, which is what is now called the Indian National Science Academy. I think at that time it was called National Institute, something of that kind, and that was in Delhi. And Professor Raman thought that it would be more appropriate to have a purely Indian academy, and Bangalore was the seat of quite a few items of research at that time, particularly the Indian Institute of Science. And he had also already set up what he thought would become the Raman Research Institute and so on. And it was really a personal effort by Professor Raman, who was able to spot people already, even before they became big and famous. He would be able to spot people saying, this fellow has spark in him. And he just invited them and made them fellows. So already there were two academies. One which was still, I think, called the National Institute, I forget what it was, in Delhi, which is thought to be more, what shall I say, not as independent Indian as what Professor Raman wanted. And along the same time, see, this is interesting, because there were three major science forces, personalities at that time in India. We are talking about the 1930s and 1940s. One clearly was C.V. Raman, which is Nobel, and with his towering personality, that was something that was very important. And the second was, his name was Meghnad Saha. Okay, Saha was a very independent Bengali gentleman scientist. Did some really remarkable work, and he thought we ought to have an academy. And at that time, Allahabad, Banaras, Calcutta, these were major areas of scientific interest and scientific research. I'm not very sure whether there was enough dialogue between Raman and Saha, but Saha actually initiated another academy in Allahabad. This then is the birth of three academies: the National Institute of Science, whatever it is called, which is now called INSA, Raman's creation, or the Indian Academy of Sciences, and Saha and his group, which is now called the National Academy of Sciences India, or NASI. So we have INSA, IISc, and NASI, almost all at about the same time. This really is a historical situation. They are not competitors of each other. They would like to collaborate. But there is still this individuality or ownership, or whatever you want to call it, that whenever somebody proposes, why don't we put all together and just have one Academy of Science? It used to be a pretty strong no. It's probably a little weaker no now. But many of us actually put together the idea that, well, we are all in the same boat. We ought to be able to work together, at least in certain areas. Okay. And so about 15 years ago, I think this theme started. The presidents and clearly the councils of the three academies decided that they can actually work together for several common themes and so on. One of them was why don't we have common selection procedure for summer research students? These are all postgraduate or maybe BSc or BTech at the last year and so on. And as I said, this move came largely from Professor Mukunda, who spearheaded this entire, and now all the three academies put together, select summer fellowships and so on. And it's a huge task. Also, all the three academies now have common workshops, teachers training, that kind of a thing. And I think the third, that most recently it's in about 2007, 2008 and so on. Again, I think quite a bit because of Mukunda, Professor Lakhotia, who is in Banaras Indian University, very active researcher and educator. They decided they'll actually put together the three academies for thinking about, should we have a 4-year degree program? What is the value of a BSc? Should we consider having a 4-year MSc program or a 5-year MSc program? Can we exit in the middle, enter in the middle? What should be the core content? Quite a bit of serious academic discussions and syllabus and so on. With respect to interacting with the government, the three academies have been somewhat circumspect, and they are essentially because there is this worry. And I want to tell you something about this. During my presidency, which was in the years 2007, 8, 9, something of that kind, there were issues of what you may call not just privacy, not just ethics, but also something wrong is being done to a professional scientist or a doctor or engineer, something of that kind, who is an academician, a member of the academy. Human rights are violated. What would you do? Should the academies keep quiet? Should they keep quiet just because they might face the anger or face the criticism of the government and so on? So we thought, particularly in the case of one professional doctor in India who was actually arrested. The case against him was of treason against Indian nation. Now, this was a too serious an affair. While we were thinking about it, the International Human Rights Commission, which is with which the US National Academy of Sciences actually collaborates, said, what are you people going to think about this? They said we should be able to go on to bodies like the UN and so on. And it occurred to me that this is an excellent chance for us to speak our minds. And so we discussed this. And we decided we'll take one step forward, and that is, if I am no longer the president, okay, I am a former president, I can collect a few other former presidents. They have sufficient respect and regard by the scientific, hopefully also by the public community. If they can speak out, and we did, and distinguished presidents like Professor Obaid Siddiqui, Professor T.V. Ramakrishnan, Professor M. Vijayan and so on. This was a multi-academy affair, not just one academy. That I think was a very positive thing. And we keep, in fact, most recently I think there is now a move to even think about it when you find not just human rights violation, but even situations like when something non-scientific is being propagated, supported, and violence happens against rationalism and so on. I think we should stand up and so forth. So the so-called committee of elders is now active. The number of scientists who involve themselves in public understanding of science is rather limited. I can only think of, at least in our academy, actually we are much better in Bangalore Academy than many other places. I can think of at least 10 people who can do that. 2 or 3 of them have made it their lives, full-time job. Madhava Gadgil, for example, without whom the Western Ghats but have already gone out. Okay, even now they are under threat. Because a government appointed committee says maybe you can take away 1/3 of them. Now, today is 1/3, tomorrow is another third. So there must be watchdogs of this kind. I'll give you the situation. There is a lot that's being talked about genetically modified organisms. We still have to have, we still do not have. We only have a government position, an activist position. Plus, minus, for, against. Has there actually been a sufficient amount of interaction? One a year is not sufficient. One a day probably is more worthwhile. And the media must also promote this. You probably know I've been doing public understanding of science for now 40 years. And I've been working with people like Professor Imam Chowdhury, who started Turning Point, with MG came in and with Yashpal and people like that. And then we find all of a sudden the carpet is taken away from you because there is no more sponsorship. So media sponsorship is very important. That is not coming about.